Snow had been falling since dawn on the morning of December 27th, the kind of wet, heavy Vancouver Island snow that doesn't belong here, that makes the cedars sag and the locals shake their heads and say something about climate change. I was standing at the window of my own kitchen in Nanaimo, holding a mug of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, watching my grandson make a snowman in the front yard with his mittens on the wrong hands. He was 6. His name is Oliver, and on that morning he was the only person in the house I could still look at without my chest tightening. My daughter-in-law was in the kitchen behind me, making toast the way she always made toast, which is to say loudly, with the kind of theatrical sighing that suggested everyone in the house had personally inconvenienced her by waking up. My son was at the table on his phone. I could hear him scrolling. I could hear the little flick of his thumb against the glass. He hadn't said good morning to me. He hadn't said anything since I'd come downstairs. The envelope was in the inside pocket of my cardigan. I could feel the weight of it against my ribs. $15,000 strung on my RBC account, made out to my son. A Boxing Day gift. A peace offering. Something I'd written the check for 2 days earlier when I was still telling myself that the tension over Christmas dinner had been about the turkey being dry, or the wine running out, or any of the small, dumb things that families pretend their fights are about. It wasn't about the turkey. I had retired in October, 41 years at the mill in Crofton, the last 15 as a shift supervisor, and on October 18th, I had walked out of those gates for the last time with a card signed by men I'd known longer than I'd known my own wife, God rest her. The pension was good. The Canada Pension Plan, NOAS, would kick in clean. I owned the house outright. I'd owned it for 12 years now since I'd paid the last installment to the credit union the year my wife was diagnosed. I had savings. I had a pickup that ran. I had what I thought was a family. What I had, it turned out, was a son who had been counting the days. My son and his wife had moved into my house in the spring of 2022. They'd come with a story. They always came with stories. This one was about a landlord in Victoria who was selling the building and the rental market being what it was, and they just needed a few months to get on their feet. My son was 38 then. He worked in IT, something was networks, something I'd never properly understood. My daughter-in-law was a dental hygienist at a clinic out in Parksville. They both had jobs. They both had cars, 2 of them, a Subaru and a leased Audi that I'd raised an eyebrow at the first time I saw it in my driveway. A few months became a year. A year became 2. Then 3. Then almost 4. I never charged them rent. Not once. They paid for their own phones and their own groceries some of the time. And I covered everything else. The property taxes, which run about $4,600 a year on this place, the BC Hydro, the natural gas, the internet, the home insurance, the new roof I'd put on in 2023 because it needed doing. When my daughter-in-law's car needed new brakes, I paid for the brakes. When my son's laptop died, I bought him a new one. I told myself this was what fathers did. I told myself my wife would have wanted it. I told myself a lot of things. What I didn't tell myself, because I didn't see it yet, was that I had stopped being a father in their eyes sometime around the 2nd year. I had become a utility, a wallet that walked around the house, something they tolerated as long as I kept the lights on and stayed out of the way. The Christmas dinner had been at my table. My turkey, my cooking, my wine. Oliver had been sweet, the way he always was, asking me if Santa got the cookies he left out, climbing into my lap to show me the dinosaur book I'd given him. I'd watched my son and his wife exchange a look across the table when Oliver did that, the kind of look you give your spouse when the dog jumps on the furniture. Like Oliver loving me was a problem they'd have to deal with later. Then on Boxing Day, after Oliver was in bed, my daughter-in-law had brought up the situation. That was the word she used. The situation. She'd been talking to friends, she said. Friends with parents who were getting older. There were programs, she said, lovely programs in Sydney and in Qualicum Beach, independent living to start, then assisted as needed. She'd printed brochures. She had brochures on the kitchen counter, glossy ones with pictures of gray-haired people doing Tai Chi. I told her I was 66. I told her I'd just retired. I told her I was in good health, that my GP had cleared me on every test he'd run that fall, that I had no plans to go anywhere. And my son had said very quietly, without looking up from his coffee, Dad, be realistic. The house is too big for one person. It makes sense if it goes to us. Oliver needs a yard. You're done working. What's the point of you rattling around in here alone? What's the point of you? That was the sentence. That was the one that landed and stayed landed. I went to bed that night and lay awake until 3 in the morning replaying it in my head, and somewhere around 2 a.m., I realized I wasn't angry. I was something colder than angry. I was awake. For the first time in maybe 2 years, I was actually awake to what was happening around me, and I could see the whole shape of it, every inch of it, like a room with the lights suddenly turned on. So on the morning of December 27th, with the snow falling and Oliver building his snowman and my coffee gone cold, I made a decision. Several decisions, actually, in quick succession, the way you do when you've been pretending not to know something for a long time and the pretending finally ends. I turned around from the window. My son was still on his phone. My daughter-in-law was buttering her toast with the kind of force that suggested the toast had insulted her family. I said, "I'm going into town. I'll be back this afternoon." My son grunted. My daughter-in-law said, "Can you pick up almond milk?" I said I could. I went upstairs. I put on a clean shirt and the good jacket. I took the check out of my cardigan pocket and looked at it for a long time. Then I tore it in half. Then in half again. Then I put the pieces in the small wood stove in the upstairs den and watched them curl and blacken and disappear. I drove down the Island Highway to the RBC branch in downtown Nanaimo. The roads were slush. There was a young teller I'd known since she was a kid. Her father had worked the line beside me at the mill for 20 years, and when she saw me come in, she smiled and waved me to her wicket. I told her I needed to speak to my financial advisor. I told her it was urgent. She made a call, and 10 minutes later I was sitting across from a woman named Priya, who I'd been working with on my retirement transition since the spring. I told Priya what I needed. Not all of it. Just the financial parts. I needed to liquidate 2 of my investment accounts, leaving the registered ones intact for tax reasons. I needed to know what I could pull clean and clear without triggering anything I'd regret in April. I needed to set up a transfer to a Portuguese bank, and I needed to know how to do that without the transfer showing up on any account my son had ever had visibility into. He never had visibility, technically. But people get nosy. People go through their parents' mail. Priya didn't ask questions. That's the thing about a good advisor. She just took notes and pulled up screens, and at one point she looked at me over her reading glasses and said, "Are you all right, sir?" And I said I would be. I said I was making some changes. She nodded once and got back to work. By the end of that meeting, I had moved roughly $210,000 into a checking account that nobody in my family knew existed. My pension and CPP were untouchable, would deposit monthly into a separate account I'd set up at a different institution that morning, a Tangerine account I'd opened on my phone in the parking lot of the Tim Hortons before driving over. I'd spent 41 years saving. I had more than that, considerably more, in the registered accounts and in equity in the house. But $210,000 was enough. Enough for what I had in mind. Enough to start. The next thing I did was drive to a lawyer's office on Commercial Street. I had an appointment. I'd made it that morning from the Tim Hortons. The lawyer was a woman named Margaret. No, I won't use her name actually. She's still practicing, and I don't want her dragged into this. Let's just say she was a lawyer. She was about my age. She'd handled my wife's estate when my wife passed. She knew me. I told her what I wanted to do. She listened for a long time without interrupting. When I was done, she said, "You understand what you're saying?" I said I did. She said, "There's no going back from some of this." I said I knew. She said, "All right then, let's get to work." I sat in her office for 3 hours that afternoon. We drafted a new will. The old one had left everything to my son. The new one left the house, when I die in trust for Oliver, to be administered by my younger brother in Kamloops, who is the most decent man I know and who has been telling me for 2 years that I needed to wake up. The trust would not be accessible to my son or my daughter-in-law in any form. Oliver would receive the proceeds of the house sale on his 25th birthday, with provisions for his post-secondary education to be paid out earlier, from a separate fund I was creating that same afternoon, and Respage top-up plus a separate informal trust, also administered by my brother. I'd been contributing to Oliver's Respark since he was born. My son had never known. I'd done it through my own bank, in my own name, and I'd let my son believe Oliver had nothing put away because every time I'd raised the topic of saving for Oliver's education, my son had laughed and said the kid had years. The kid had years. The kid had a grandfather who had been quietly planning for them since the day Oliver was born. Then we drafted the eviction notice. 60 days. That's what the Residential Tenancy Act of British Columbia requires for a landlord who wants their property back for personal use. And although my son and daughter-in-law had no formal tenancy agreement, my lawyer told me to file the notice as if they did, to dot every I, because people like my son sometimes get litigious when reality finally catches up to them. The notice was clean. It was legal. It would be served by registered courier on January 2nd, the first business day of the new year. The last document was a letter. I wrote it myself, longhand, on a yellow legal pad in my lawyer's conference room while she made phone calls in the next office. I'm not going to reproduce the whole thing here. Some of it is between me and my son. But the structure of it, I'll tell you. It had 3 parts. The first part was an itemized invoice. I'd been keeping records, you see. Not because I'd ever planned to use them, just out of habit, because I'm an old mill foreman and I write things down. Property taxes paid on their behalf for 45 months. Utilities. Groceries. The roof. The brakes. The laptop. The down payment I'd given them in 2021 on the Audi when they'd whined about needing better transportation for the baby, and which they'd never paid back, and which I'd written off in my own head as a gift, but which I now itemized at $6,400. I added it all up. The total came to $87,432 and change. 4 years. 87 grand. A working class man's retirement, handed over to 2 people with full-time jobs and a leased Audi. The second part was a statement. It said I was leaving the country. It said I was not coming back for at least a year, possibly longer. It said I would not be reachable by phone or by email. It said any attempt to contact me through Oliver, or through my brother, or through my brother, would be met with silence. It said the house was being repossessed by me, the legal owner, on the timeline outlined in the attached eviction notice. It said the new will was filed, was sealed, was none of their business in any practical sense, but they should know they were no longer in it. The third part was the only part that hurt to write. It was about Oliver. It said I loved him. It said I would write to him. It said there was a savings account in his name that I had been funding for 6 years, and that on his 18th birthday he would receive a letter from my brother explaining where it had come from. It said his grandmother, my wife, had loved him before she ever met him, had bought him a stuffed bear when she was dying that I'd given him on his 2nd birthday and that he probably didn't remember. It said the bear was from her. It said when he was older he should ask about her. It said his grandfather had not abandoned him. His grandfather had simply done what was necessary. I signed all of it. My lawyer notarized what needed notarizing. I paid her in full and shook her hand. She said, "Take care of yourself out there." I said I would try. I drove home in the dark. The snow had stopped. The roads were better. When I got to the house, my son's Audi was in the driveway, and my daughter-in-law's Subaru was on the street, and the lights were on in the kitchen, and I could see them through the window. The 2 of them eating dinner without me. They hadn't waited. They hadn't called to ask where I was. I'd been gone 9 hours, and they hadn't noticed. I went inside. I said hello. I said I'd had errands. My daughter-in-law said the almond milk. I'd forgotten the almond milk. She made a face. My son didn't look up. I went upstairs and I packed. 2 suitcases. 41 years of my life in 2 suitcases. It's funny what you take, in the end. Some clothes. The good watch my wife gave me for our 30th. A stack of letters she'd written me when we were dating, before email, when she was teaching in Prince George and I was at the mill. Photographs, the small ones. the ones in the leather album I'd had since the kids were little. My passport, which I'd renewed in November on a hunch I hadn't admitted to myself I was having. A book I was halfway through. My reading glasses, the bear from my wife, the duplicate of Oliver's that I'd kept for myself and never told anybody about. That was it. The rest of it, the furniture and the dishes and the tools in the garage and the lawnmower and the records in the basement, the rest of it was just stuff. Stuff my son could keep or sell or burn for all I cared. I slept 4 hours that night. At 5 a.m., I got up, went down to the kitchen, made coffee. I left a note on the kitchen table, just a few lines, saying I was going on a trip, would be in touch in a week or two. The lawyer would be sending a package they should read carefully. I put the envelope, the real envelope, the one with the letter and the invoice and the eviction notice and a copy of the new will, in the center of the table where my son sat for breakfast. Then I went up to Oliver's room. He was asleep. He had his thumb in his mouth, which his parents had been trying to break him of. And I was glad on that morning that they hadn't succeeded yet. I kissed the top of his head. I whispered something to him. I'm not going to repeat. I left the small stuffed bear, the duplicate one, on his pillow next to him. With a tag I'd written it said, "From Grandma. She loved you first." I drove to the Nanaimo airport in the dark. I had a one-way ticket on the morning flight to Vancouver, and from Vancouver a connection to Toronto, and from Toronto a direct flight to Lisbon. I'd booked it all from my phone the night before in the lawyer's parking lot. I'd booked an Airbnb in a neighborhood called Alfama for the first month. I had no plans beyond that. I figured I'd find some. Lisbon was 12 degrees and sunny when I landed. I remember walking out of the terminal with my 2 suitcases and feeling the air on my face and starting to cry, properly cry, for the first time since my wife's funeral. It was the kind of crying you do when something has been clamped down for so long that you'd forgotten it was there. I stood on the curb at Humberto Delgado Airport, and a Portuguese cabbie watched me with patient, kind eyes and finally said, "Senor, are you all right?" "Where do you go?" I told him Alfama. He nodded. He helped me with my bags. He said, "First time?" I said yes. He said, "You will like it. Most people do." I did like it. I do like it. I do like it. I'm writing this from a small apartment with a balcony that looks out over the red rooftops down toward the Tahoe River. And there's a cafe at the bottom of my street where I have a coffee every morning with a man named Joao, who's 81 years old and was a fisherman and who speaks better English than my son does. I've learned about 300 words of Portuguese. I've made friends. I've started walking again, properly walking 4 or 5 kilometers a day on the cobblestones, which is doing wonders for my back. I've gained weight in a good way. I look in the mirror and I see somebody who isn't gray around the eyes anymore. The lawyer's package was delivered on January 2nd, as planned. I know this because my brother called me from Kamloops on the encrypted app I'd set up for him. He told me the calls had started about an hour later. My son first, ranting, then crying, then ranting again. My daughter-in-law next, leaving a 13-minute voicemail that my brother described as a master class in the kind of language you don't repeat in front of a child. Then, the both of them together, demanding to know where I was, demanding to know if this was legal, demanding to know what right I had. What right? That was the word my daughter-in-law kept using. What right? My brother told them what right. My brother is calmer than I am. My brother told them, very politely, that I was the legal owner of the property, that the eviction notice was valid, that the will was none of their business, but had been filed with the appropriate authorities, and that any further calls would be forwarded to my lawyer. He said they had 60 days to find new accommodations. He said he was sorry it had come to this. He said it twice. I think he meant it both times. They moved out on day 58. They had to. They'd spent 4 years not saving, and even with their 2 incomes, the rental market on the island was brutal. They ended up in a 2-bedroom in a building near the Parksville Highway that my brother described as fine structurally. They sold the Audi to make first and last. My son, my brother told me, had aged about 10 years in 2 months. He'd stopped sleeping. He'd lost his job in March, something to do with his performance, My brother didn't have details. My daughter-in-law was still at the dental clinic. They were fighting. The neighbors could hear them. I want to tell you that I felt nothing when my brother told me all of that. I want to tell you I'd reached some serene, monk-like place, where the suffering of the people who had hurt me was just weather, just something happening on the other side of the world. That's not true. I felt things. I felt sad for my son, who had once been a little boy who held my hand when we walked to the corner store. I felt furious at my daughter-in-law, which is probably unfair, because my son was an adult who made his own choices and she didn't make them for him. But I felt it anyway. I felt a strange, sharp grief for the version of my family I'd been pretending we had. Mostly, though, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. I felt like a person. Not a wallet. Not a utility. Not a problem to be solved. A person with a body and a name and a passport and a balcony in Alfama. Oliver got my first letter in early February. I'd written it on the airplane. I'd told him I loved him. And I told him I was on an adventure, far away, and I told him about the river in Lisbon, and the boats, and the trams that go up the steep hills. I told him I would write again. I'd told him that no matter what his parents said about me, his grandfather loved him, and his grandmother had loved him, and that love doesn't go away just because somebody is in a different country. My brother says Oliver received the letter and asked his parents to read it to him. My son apparently threw it in the recycling. My brother retrieved it the next time he was over there visiting Oliver, smoothed it out, brought it back to his own house, and reads it to Oliver every Sunday afternoon when the kid comes for a sleepover. My brother has been having Oliver for sleepovers every weekend since February. He drives over from Kamloops. It's a haul. He does it anyway. Oliver, my brother says, is sturdy. Oliver is fine. Oliver asks about me. I write him a letter every week. I send them to my brother, who reads them aloud. I am building, in those letters, a record of who I am and who his grandmother was, so that when he is old enough to ask the harder questions, there will be something for him to read. There will be a man on the page, a man who didn't disappear, a man who loved him. 6 months after I left, my son sent a letter through the lawyer. The lawyer forwarded it to me unopened. I read it on my balcony with a glass of Vinho Verde and the sun going down over the river. He asked for forgiveness. He said he understood now. He said he wanted to talk. He said his marriage was struggling. He said he was sorry. I wrote back. 1 page. I told him I forgave him, because I do, more or less, in the way you forgive somebody for something that has changed you forever. I told him I wished him well. I told him I loved him. I told him I would not be coming home. Not now, not next year, possibly not ever, and that the financial arrangements were permanent, and that any relationship we might rebuild would be built slowly, on his initiative, with no expectations, and absolutely none of it would involve him living in my house or accessing my money. I told him Oliver was the one who deserved his attention, not me. I sent the letter. I haven't heard back. I don't expect to, particularly. But I'll be ready if I do. I'm 67 years old now. I had a birthday in May. João and his wife had me over for dinner, and they made cataplana, which is a Portuguese fish stew, and they sang me a Portuguese birthday song, and gave me a card in Portuguese that I had to translate later with an app. The card said, "Para o nosso amigo canadiano, que encontrou a sua casa conosco." For our Canadian friend, who found his home with us. I sat in their kitchen, and I cried again. Different kind of crying this time. The thing nobody tells you about getting older, about being told you're done, about being asked what the point of view is that the question is actually a gift if you let it be. It is the question you should be asking yourself anyway, every single morning at every age. What is the point of you? Not what others think. What you think. What you would do if nobody was watching. What you would build if nobody was waiting for you to die so they could have your house. The point of me, it turns out, was not to spend my retirement subsidizing the life of a man who had decided I was furniture. The point of me was to be a grandfather to a 6-year-old boy who was going to grow up knowing, without doubt, that he was loved. The point of me was to learn Portuguese badly. The point of me was to walk on cobblestones until my back stopped hurting. The point of me was to find out, finally, in my 67th year, that I was still a person. My son thought he could ask me what the point of me was, and that would be the end of it. It was the beginning. In the envelope I left on the kitchen table that morning, the one with the invoice and the eviction notice and the letter and the will. That envelope did not contain a check for $15,000. It contained the truth of what they had cost me, and the truth of what they had lost, and the truth of who I had decided to become. That envelope destroyed them, and it saved me. I've thought a lot, in these quiet Lisbon mornings, about how a person ends up where I ended up that Boxing Day. It doesn't happen all at once. That's the part I want anyone watching this to understand. My son didn't wake up one morning and decide his father was furniture. My daughter-in-law didn't print those brochures the first week she moved into my house. It happened the way most damage happens in a family, slowly, one small, unanswered moment at a time, and every time I let one of those moments slide, I was teaching them what I would tolerate. The cause was my own silence. The effect was 4 years of being treated like a wallet with gray hair. I built that arrangement, brick by brick, by being too kind to say no, and too tired to set a line and call it a line. What I learned, sitting in that lawyer's office on Commercial Street, is that decency without backbone isn't decency at all. It's just a slow form of disappearing. I had spent 41 years at the mill, teaching young men how to do dangerous work safely, how to refuse an unsafe job, how to speak up when something wasn't right, and somewhere along the way, I'd forgotten to apply any of those rules to my own home. I had let Daniel learn that I would always pay. I had let Tasha learn that the brochures would land without consequence. And then, I'd been surprised when they asked the obvious next question, which was, what's the point of me? Because I had stopped showing them and stopped showing myself. The hard part of getting older isn't the body you can manage. The hard part is the quiet temptation to settle, to call cowardice peace, to call self-erasure love. I want to tell you something I wish somebody had told me at 50. Your character is not finished. Not at 60. Not at 70. There's still time, every single day, to choose courage over comfort. And that choice is the difference between a retirement that ends you and a retirement that returns you to yourself. I think about Oliver a lot. I write him these letters that my brother reads to him, and am building, slowly, a kind of inheritance that has nothing to do with money. I want him to know that his grandfather was not a man who walked away. His grandfather was a man who walked towards something. There is a difference, and a 6-year-old will understand the difference one day, even if the adults in his house never do. If you're watching this and you recognize your own kitchen in mine, your own son in Daniel, your own silence in the silence I kept for too long, I want you to know it is not too late. It was not too late for me at 66, and it is not too late for you. Self-respect is not a luxury you earn at the end of a long, obedient life. It's the soil. Without it, nothing grows. Plant it now. The point of view is whatever you decide it is, the moment you decide it.